The primeval forests of upstate New York were never meant for the boots of an empire. In the dead heat of July, the humidity does not just burn, it suffocates, settling into the deep woods like a wet, heavy shroud. Through this claustrophobic green hell, a column of men stretches for miles. But these are not frontiersmen in buckskin. These are the Compagnies Franches de la Marine, the elite, professional infantry of King Louis XIV of France. They are marching through a stagnant, mosquito-choked swamp, wearing heavy, long-skirted coats of white and blue wool, weighed down by 50 pounds of gear, hauling massive matchlock and flintlock muskets. They are sweating, dying of thirst, and cursing the impenetrable brush that tears at their pristine uniforms. They are the most advanced, disciplined military machine on the planet, and they are marching blindly into a geographical meat grinder. We are taught that the conquest of North America was a steady, inevitable march of European military supremacy. We are told that regular armies with their drums, their linear tactics, and their disciplined volleys easily swept aside the indigenous resistance. But the archives tell a much darker story. They tell the story of the summer of 1687, when a European superpower tried to force a conventional war in a suffocating, swampy primeval wilderness, and sank into a terrifying labyrinth of asymmetric warfare that washed away their imperial arrogance in blood. History is never what you think. To understand the sheer scale of the disaster, you must understand the arrogance of the expedition. By 1687, the French colonial empire in North America was bleeding. The Iroquois Confederacy had repeatedly shattered French trade routes, hijacking the flow of beaver pelts and threatening to bankrupt the colony of New France. The Governor-General in Montreal, the Marquis de Denonville, decided that the era of fragile diplomacy was over. He would launch a punitive expedition so massive, so technologically overwhelming, that it would break the spine of the Iroquois once and for all. His target was the Seneca Nation. They were the keepers of the Western Door, the most numerous, aggressive, and strategically vital branch of the Iroquois Confederacy. Denonville did not assemble a raiding party. He assembled an armada. He gathered 800 French regular soldiers directly from Europe. He conscripted over 1,000 Canadian militia. He bullied, bribed, and persuaded hundreds of indigenous allies, Huron, Algonquin, and Christian Mohawks, to join the campaign. In total, an army of nearly 3,000 men boarded hundreds of flat-bottomed bateaux and birch-bark canoes and rowed across the vast, treacherous expanse of Lake Ontario. The logistical effort was staggering. They carried massive brass cannons, thousands of pounds of black powder, and tons of salted pork. It was the largest European military force ever projected into the interior of the continent. When they landed on the southern shore of Lake Ontario, at Iroquois Bay, Denonville ordered his men to construct a heavy stockade to protect the boats. Then, the drums beat the advance. The elite infantry formed their columns, shouldered their weapons, and marched south into the dense canopy of the Seneca homeland. They expected the Seneca to cower behind wooden palisades, waiting for the French cannons to blast them into submission. They expected a siege. The Seneca had no intention of fighting a siege. They intended to fight a haunting. The Seneca had watched the French armada cross the lake. They had tracked the massive, noisy, clumsy column from the moment it stepped off the boats. They knew exactly how many men Denonville had, how fast they were moving, and how exhausted they were becoming. The French military doctrine dictated that soldiers march in tight formations, shoulder to shoulder, maintaining discipline. In the open fields of Flanders, this tactic was devastating. In the untamed forests of North America, it was a death sentence. The trail leading to the Seneca capital was not a wide road. It was a narrow, winding path that snaked through deep ravines, dense thickets of briar, and muddy swamps. The 3,000-man French column was forced into a thin, vulnerable line stretching for miles. Communication from the vanguard to the rear guard was virtually impossible. On July 13, 1687, the temperature soared. The French regulars, clad in thick wool, were dropping from heat exhaustion. The air was thick with horseflies and mosquitoes. The men were blinded by their own sweat, hacking through the undergrowth, their heavy muskets snagging on every vine. A few miles from the main Seneca town, near the modern-day town of Victor, New York, the trail descended into a deep, muddy defile, flanked by steep, heavily wooded hills and a dense cedar swamp. It was a textbook geographic choke point. Wading in the thick, humid brush on both sides of the trail were 800 Seneca warriors. They had not built a wall. They had seamlessly integrated themselves into the foliage. They smeared their skin with mud to mask their scent and their visual signature. They lay perfectly still in the suffocating heat, their fingers resting on the triggers of English-traded Dutch muskets. They let the French indigenous scouts pass. They let the Canadian militia pass. They waited until the core of the French column, the pristine, elite regulars of the Marine, were directly at the bottom of the ravine, bogged down in the mud, completely surrounded by elevated, invisible positions. Then, the woods detonated. There was no warning, no war cries, just a sudden, deafening roar of overlapping musket fire from the trees. Hundreds of heavy lead balls slammed into the French column simultaneously. The first volley was absolutely devastating. Officers on horseback were the primary targets. They were shot out of their saddles, their horses screaming and thrashing in the mud, instantly decapitating the French chain of command. The psychological shock of an ambush in a dense forest is incomprehensible to a soldier trained for open-field combat. When the Seneca fired, the black powder generated massive clouds of thick, acrid white smoke. The dense canopy of the trees trapped the smoke in the ravine. Within seconds, the French soldiers were plunged into a blinding, choking fog. They could not see the enemy. They could barely see the man standing next to them. They could only see the muzzle flashes erupting from the phantom brush. Panic, the ultimate enemy of the professional soldier, seized the French lines. The regulars attempted to execute the maneuvers they had drilled in Paris. They tried to form firing lines. They raised their heavy muskets and fired blind, perfectly synchronized volleys directly into the empty leaves. They were shooting at smoke. Worse, in the chaos and the fog, the French lines lost all spatial awareness. As the Canadian militia and the indigenous allies tried to fall back and regroup, the terrified French regulars mistook them for the Seneca. The French began firing on their own men. Friendly fire tore through the ranks. The discipline of the Compagnies Franches de la Marine completely shattered. Men broke ranks, threw down their heavy muskets, and tried to claw their way backward out of the swamp. The most powerful army in the world was dissolving into a terrified, screaming mob in the mud. The Seneca dropped their empty muskets, drew their steel-trade tomahawks, and descended from the hills into the smoke to finish the rout. If the battle had relied solely on the European troops, Denonville's entire command would have been liquidated in that swamp, their bones left to sink into the peat. What saved the French Empire that day was not French tactics, nor French steel. It was the very people they viewed as savages. Denonville's indigenous allies, the Huron, the Algonquin, and the Christian Mohawks, did not panic. They understood the grim, brutal mechanics of woodland warfare. While the French regulars were shooting each other in the smoke, the Allied warriors dropped their packs, took to the trees, and met the Seneca head-on. The combat devolved into savage, hand-to-hand kinetic trauma. It was a war of knives, ball-headed war clubs, and hatchets in the blinding fog. The Allied warriors fought with a ferocity that stunned the French officers. They anchored the flanks, preventing the Seneca from completely encircling and annihilating the retreating French infantry. The Canadian militia, accustomed to the harsh realities of the frontier, eventually rallied and joined the counterattack, using the trees for cover instead of standing in rigid, suicidal lines. Facing a highly organized, lethal resistance from their indigenous peers, and having achieved their primary objective of inflicting massive psychological and physical damage, the Seneca executed a flawless tactical withdrawal. They gathered their dead and wounded, melted back into the deep woods, and vanished as quickly as they had appeared. The firing stopped. The smoke slowly drifted up through the canopy. The French regulars were left standing knee-deep in swamp water, surrounded by their dead, their pristine uniforms soaked in blood and mud. They had survived, but their illusion of imperial invincibility had been permanently shattered. Denonville quickly declared the ambush a victory, citing the fact that the Seneca had ultimately retreated from the field. It was the desperate spin of a commander, trying to justify a catastrophic tactical humiliation. The French army spent the next 2 days cowering in a fortified camp, terrified of a second ambush. When they finally summoned the courage to march on the Seneca capital at Ganondagan, they found it abandoned and burning. The Seneca, executing a flawless scorched earth strategy, had set fire to their own longhouses and retreated to the east, refusing to give the French the satisfaction of a siege. Denonville spent the next week waging war on vegetables. Unable to catch the Seneca warriors, the massive French army was reduced to hacking down cornfields with their swords and slaughtering the Seneca's massive herds of domesticated pigs. They burned an estimated 1.2 million bushels of stored and standing corn. Denonville believed that by destroying their food supply, he had crippled the Seneca Nation. He was wrong. He had only succeeded in pissing them off. The logistics of the French retreat were a nightmare. The army had exhausted its own supplies. Dysentery ripped through the ranks, brought on by drinking stagnant swamp water and a lack of sanitation. The elite soldiers of France dragged themselves back to their boats, sick, starving, and psychologically broken, constantly looking over their shoulders at the dark tree line. The Denonville expedition of 1687 is a brutal masterclass in the limits of conventional power. You can possess the finest firearms, the most expensive uniforms, and the most rigorous military training on the European continent. But when you march into an environment that actively resists your presence, your training becomes a liability. The French tried to fight a war of lines and geometry in a world of circles and shadows. The Seneca lost their corn, but they did not lose their capacity for violence. 2 years later, fueled by the rage of Denonville's invasion, the Iroquois Confederacy would bypass the French forts and launch the devastating Lachine Massacre, burning the settlements right outside the gates of Montreal itself. The green hell of upstate New York proved that an empire's reach is dictated strictly by the limits of its logistics and its adaptability. The French regulars learned the hard way that in the deep woods, a silk flag and a brass cannon mean absolutely nothing when the trees themselves start shooting back.